Old woman saved 4 orphan bear cubs, but what happened was unbelievable. The town of Pinehurst was the sort of place that appeared untouched by time, tucked high in the mountains where fog lingered until noon and every chimney still whispered wood smoke into the sky. In early April, the snow was just beginning to surrender, trickling down pine roots and soaking into dark, thawing earth. Clara Winslow stood at the edge of her porch, wrapped in a thick gray shawl, a chipped ceramic mug warming her hands. Her gaze lingered on the forest's edge, where tree trunks stood like sentinels and the wind carried stories only she could still hear. At 78, Clara had lived in her cedar cabin longer than most residents of Pinehurst had been alive. She was a woman of quiet patterns, tea at dawn, pruning the sleeping garden, knitting by the fire as chickadees darted past the frost-dusted windows. Her joints ached, yes, and her breath came a little slower, but there was a steel in her spine that age could not bend. Long ago, she had been more than a retired teacher. She had once held falcons under her arm, stitched fox wounds under moonlight, and fed milk to a bear cub no bigger than a loaf of bread. Those days, though, felt like a dream stored in dusty boxes, until the morning someone knocked on her door. The sound startled her. Not many people came this far up the mountain without reason, especially not before breakfast. Clara set her mug on the windowsill and moved to the door, where 3 firm knocks echoed again. When she opened it, the cold rushed in along with the scent of pine, damp earth, and a memory. Jake Warren stood there, broad-shouldered in his green uniform, the same cowlick poking from beneath his cap that he'd had as a 12-year-old. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, Miss Winslow," he said, removing his cap. "I'm sorry to come unannounced, but I need your help." Clara studied him for a moment. Jake had been one of her best students, earnest, curious, always the first to volunteer when she brought an injured bird to class. Now he was 35 and the local wildlife officer. She motioned him inside. "Come in before the cold steals your tongue." Jake stepped over the threshold and Clara closed the door behind him. "What kind of trouble are we in?" she asked. Jake glanced around, as if uncertain how to begin. "There were poachers up near Black Creek. We found the mother bear yesterday, shot and left behind." Clara's breath caught. She didn't need to ask what came next. "Cubs," she said softly. Jake nodded. 3 of them. Maybe 6 weeks old. "We took them in, but the sanctuaries are all full, and without a proper maternal figure, the state can't approve their long-term care. They need someone who knows what they're doing. Someone who's done it before." Clara blinked, the weight of what he was asking settling like snow on her shoulders. "You know I haven't done that work in years," she said. "That was another life." "But you haven't forgotten," Jake replied gently. "You're the only one who ever raised a cub that survived in the wild." "I checked the records." Clara turned away, her hand gripping the back of a wooden chair. "I'm too old for this, Jake. Too slow. Too brittle." Jake took a step forward. "I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. They're just babies, Clara. They don't have anyone else." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. Clara stared at the hearth, where ashes from the previous night's fire still glowed faintly. She saw suddenly the image of a young bear cub with honey-brown eyes, clumsy and wild, curling at her feet as if he belonged nowhere else in the world. She had let that part of herself grow quiet, tucked it away behind years of solitude. But it stirred now, slowly. Clara nodded. "How long until they're here?" Jake's relief was immediate. "I've got them in the truck." An hour later, Clara found herself kneeling in the patchy sunlight of her yard, watching as Jake gently lifted 3 squirming bundles from the back of the state vehicle. "Bruno," he said, placing a sturdier cub down first. "This one's a bit more nervous. And that's Tola, the smallest." Clara reached out a hand toward Tola, who whimpered and retreated into the folds of the towel she was wrapped in. Bruno, on the other hand, waddled toward Clara's boot and sniffed it curiously. She chuckled softly. "So bold already." Inside, the sunroom became their nursery. Clara cleared away her houseplants, swept the floor clean, and laid down layers of blankets. She unearthed an old heat lamp from the shed and rigged it above a crate lined with hay. Her hands were slower now, but they remembered. When she finally settled into the rocking chair, the cubs nestled close to each other under the warm light, their eyes blinking slowly, trust forming like frost crystals in reverse, melting into comfort. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat near the door of the sunroom, watching their small bellies rise and fall. They whimpered occasionally, confused and motherless, their dreams twitching behind closed eyes. Clara hummed softly, an old tune her mother had once sung to her as a child. The sound wrapped around the room like smoke, soothing and familiar. Outside, a late frost glazed the ground. The moon hung heavy over the treetops. In the silence, Clara felt something she hadn't in years. Not burdened. Not overwhelmed. But purposeful. The cubs stirred, and she rose to refill their milk formula, her back stiff but steady as she leaned down to brush a strand of hay from Tola's tiny ear. The cub gave a sleepy huff and nudged her hand. Clara's chest tightened. "You're safe now," she whispered, echoing words she hadn't spoken in decades. By morning, the forest outside her cabin no longer looked so silent. The trees stood taller. The air felt more alive. Clara Winslow, once thought too old to mend wild things, had answered a knock not just at her door, but at the part of herself that had never truly gone quiet. And in return, 3 orphaned lives had stepped over her threshold and into her care, with the fragile trust of beings who had lost everything and were still willing to hope. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 2, and I'll continue seamlessly from this point, deepening Clara's bond with the cubs and showing the joy and struggle of raising wild creatures on the edge of solitude. The days that followed unfolded like the slow turning of a page, each one quiet, deliberate, yet filled with a rhythm Clara hadn't known she still possessed. At dawn, she would stir a pot of formula on the old gas stove, careful to test the temperature on the inside of her wrist. She moved with an unexpected steadiness, the clink of glass bottles, the scrape of metal bowls, the rustle of straw now her morning soundtrack. The bear cubs, Bruno, Kota, and Tola, were still adjusting, their movements hesitant, like children waking in an unfamiliar home. Bruno remained the boldest. He would stumble toward Clara with wide paws and curious sniffs, nudging at her ankles or trying to climb the legs of her chair. Kota hung back, his small body curled behind the others, watching with cautious eyes that reminded Clara of the raccoons she used to rehabilitate, clever, wary, and waiting. Tola was quiet, always a beat behind the others, but her gaze never left Clara. There was something deep in those eyes, something watchful and patient, as if she understood the stakes more than the others. Clara took to speaking to them as she worked, her voice low and even, not for their comprehension, but for the rhythm it gave the day. "You'll need strong legs, Bruno," she'd say, brushing straw from his fur. "That ridge up north doesn't forgive clumsy climbers." She'd kneel to gently stroke Tola's soft head. "You've got to eat, darling, or you'll fall behind." It became a ritual, words in place of lullabies, gestures in place of a mother's warmth. She built them an enclosure outside the cabin using old timber and leftover fencing from her gardening days. With Jake's help, she constructed a gate and reinforced the corners with stones and chicken wire. By the end of the week, the cubs could tumble about in the fresh air, claws gripping into bark, teeth gnawing on sticks, their energy growing with each passing hour. Watching them, Clara felt something stir in her chest, an ache and a joy braided so tightly she couldn't name it. Her bones hurt by evening, her hands swelled from the work, and yet she hadn't felt this alive in years. She would sit on the back porch, a blanket over her knees, sipping peppermint tea as the cubs played, the setting sun washing their fur in gold. Sometimes, she thought of the old bear she'd raised decades ago, a lone cub found beside a wrecked logging road, barely breathing. She'd named him Samson. He'd stayed until he was nearly grown, then wandered off into the pines without a backward glance. She never saw him again, but for years afterward, she found claw marks on her fence posts and paw prints near the stream. Signs that he remembered, perhaps, or maybe signs that she had simply hoped too hard. One morning, she found Tala sleeping apart from the others, her tiny frame shivering. Clara bundled her into a towel and held her near the stove, stroking her back until the trembling eased. "You've got to stay with me, little one," she whispered. "You've come too far already." And she added more protein to their milk, crushed vitamins into paste, and coaxed every ounce of strength she could into their fragile bodies. Slowly, Tala began to recover, and the worry that had lodged itself in Clara's throat eased slightly. As weeks passed, the cubs grew stronger, braver. Bruno learned to climb the stack of firewood by the side of the house, while Kota discovered how to pry open the screen door if Clara forgot the latch. Tala, once the quietest, became the most observant. She'd watch birds with a predator's stillness, eyes flicking with calculation. Clara began tapering her contact. She knew from experience that wild things had to forget softness to survive. She stopped sitting near the enclosure and instead watched from the kitchen window. When feeding, she wore gloves and used long-handled tools. It was harder than she expected. Each step back felt like pulling her own heart through a narrow gap. But she did it. Because love, real love, meant giving them the future they deserved, not the comfort she craved. Jake came every few days to check on their progress. He was careful with his words, respectful of Clara's space, but she could see the amazement in his eyes. "They're thriving," he said one afternoon, watching Bruno wrestle with Kota in a heap of pine needles. "It's working." Clara nodded, though she didn't look away from the cubs. "They'll be ready by midsummer." And they were. By June, the cubs were almost unrecognizable from the trembling infants she'd first seen on Jake's truck seat. Their coats had grown thick and glossy, muscles formed beneath their fur, and their movements had shifted from clumsy to confident. The release came in early July. Clara didn't go with them. She said her goodbyes the night before, alone, kneeling in the enclosure as dusk settled around them. "Be wild," she whispered, kissing Tala's head. "Be safe." Jake loaded them into separate crates, carefully sedated and bundled. He promised to take them to a national park far enough away to avoid human contact, a place where poaching was rare and protection strong. Clara stood on her porch and watched the truck disappear down the mountain road. When the taillights vanished, she let herself cry, not the heavy sobs of loss, but the quiet tears of someone who had once again remembered what it meant to matter. That night, the cabin felt cavernous. The sunroom was too quiet, the enclosure out back too still. Clara walked the perimeter anyway, out of habit, checking the latch even though there was nothing left to contain. The forest rustled with summer life, but to her, it sounded hollow. She made tea and sat by the window. She didn't regret letting them go, she knew that was the point, but a part of her, the part she thought had long gone dormant, felt newly tender. She fell asleep in her chair, the mug cooling on the side table, her dreams filled with paw prints in the dirt and the sound of cubs rustling in the ferns. In the weeks that followed, she tried to return to her routine. She pruned the garden, repainted the porch rail, even started a new knitting project. But she found herself listening, always listening, for sounds that never came. Until one night in November, when the wind shifted again, carrying with it a scent Clara hadn't smelled in months. She stood at the door, breath visible in the cold, and listened. The forest was quiet, snow falling in lazy spirals. Then, from deep among the trees, a low huff, barely audible. She leaned forward, heart thundering. There, between the shadows, 3 shapes stood at the edge of the woods, silent, unmoving. Bears. Full-grown. Wild. But still watching. Clara didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply placed a hand to her chest and nodded once. The largest of them, Bruno, she was sure, lifted his head slightly. Then the trio turned and vanished into the trees. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in months, the knowledge settling into her bones like warmth. They had returned, not for comfort, not for help, but for her. They remembered. And that, Clara thought as she drifted into sleep, was enough. The first true snow came early that winter, descending on Pinehurst like a whispered warning. By mid-December, Clara's cabin was wrapped in white, the porch sagging beneath the weight of fresh drifts, the woods beyond her garden silent and still. Smoke curled lazily from her chimney, and inside, the warmth of the hearth spread in waves, casting amber light across the wooden walls lined with old books, faded photographs, and the worn tools of her past life. Clara moved slower now, her joints aching more each morning, but her spirit was clearer, sharper, like mountain air after a storm. She often found herself staring out the window, watching the snow fall with an odd sense of anticipation, as if she were waiting for something she couldn't name. The bear cubs, no, the bears now, had not returned after that night in November, and she hadn't expected them to. That moment at the forest's edge, brief and wordless, had been enough. She had seen them, seen what they had become, and that had filled her with something fierce and quiet and sacred. They had remembered her, but they had chosen the wild, as they should. Still, as the days grew darker and the nights stretched long and cold, Clara found herself hoping. It was the first day of the year's worst storm when everything changed. The snow began before noon, thick flakes falling in erratic swirls, carried sideways by the wind. By evening, the forest was a wall of white, and the world outside the cabin disappeared. Clara had spent the afternoon securing firewood, double-checking the window latches, and laying thick towels under the front and back doors. She made herself a bowl of soup and settled into her armchair by the fire, the flames crackling softly as the wind howled around the cabin like a voice that wanted to be let in. She was almost asleep when it happened, a sudden crash, loud and close. Clara jerked upright, her heart pounding. For a moment, she thought it might be a tree branch, heavy with snow, falling onto the porch roof. But then came another noise, sharper, intentional, a thump against the back door. Then a voice, muffled by the wind, "Open up," it snarled, rough and low. "I know you're in there, old woman." Clara's breath froze in her chest. She rose slowly, setting her mug aside with trembling hands. She moved to the hallway, stopping at the edge of the kitchen, listening. Footsteps crunched in the snow outside, heavy, male. Another voice joined the first, angrier, younger. "Kick it in," the second man shouted. "Ain't nobody else for miles. She's got wood, food, maybe something worth taking." Clara backed away from the door, her pulse hammering. She had no phone, no neighbors within shouting distance. The snow had cut off the road hours ago. There would be no help. She grabbed the old shotgun she kept above the mantel, unloaded in years, more memory than weapon, and stepped quietly toward the rear of the house. Before she reached the door, it exploded inward with a deafening crack, snow and wood splinters bursting into the kitchen. The wind rushed in behind it, scattering papers, smoke, and 1,000 fragile things. 2 men entered, one tall and broad with a scarf wrapped around his face, the other wiry and jittery, eyes scanning like a feral animal's. Clara stood frozen, the gun gripped in her hands, her voice caught in her throat. The tall man saw her first. "Look what we got here," he sneered, stepping forward. "Old lady with a rifle?" The wiry one laughed, though it sounded thin and forced. "Put that down before you break your hip." Clara didn't move. Her hands trembled, but her eyes did not. "Get out," she said, her voice steady now, a cold resolve rising in her chest. "You don't belong here." The tall man lunged forward and swatted the gun from her grip. It clattered to the floor, useless. He shoved Clara hard, sending her stumbling into the wall. Her head struck wood, and for a moment the world dimmed. She sank to her knees, blood trickling down her temple, her breath ragged. The men began tearing through the kitchen, tossing drawers, breaking jars, laughing as they smashed through her solitude. Clara lay still, her hand pressed to her bleeding head, her vision swimming. She could hear the floorboards creak under their boots, could hear them moving toward the front room, toward the fire. One of them shouted something about the storm, about waiting it out here. Clara tried to stand but collapsed again, her legs too weak. She closed her eyes, trying to will herself to remain conscious. Then something changed, a sound, faint, low, almost imagined. A deep, guttural huff followed by another and another. It came from outside, just beyond the broken door. The wind carried it in, unfamiliar yet unmistakable. The men didn't hear it at first, too focused on their ransacking, but Clara's heart quickened. She knew that sound. Knew it like breath. The bears. Another growl echoed, louder now, closer. This time, the men froze. "What the hell was that?" the tall one said, turning toward the broken door. The wiry man cursed under his breath, moving to peer into the storm. "Could be a moose," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Clara forced herself upright, bracing against the wall. Her vision blurred, but she could see their shapes now, 3 massive shadows emerging from the blizzard. Bruno at the center, larger than she remembered, his thick winter coat dusted with snow. To his left, Kota, ears flat, body low and tense. And on the right, Tala, her eyes sharp and fixed, every inch of her a storm. The men backed away as the bears stepped onto the porch, snow swirling around them like ghosts. "Close the door," the tall one shouted, but it was too late. Bruno charged first, smashing into the frame, splinters flying. The wiry man screamed as Kota lunged, swiping a paw across his arm, sending him crashing into the wall. Tala moved with terrifying grace, cutting off their escape. Chaos erupted in the cabin, furniture overturned, dishes shattered, the fire roaring brighter as if fueled by fear itself. The tall man tried to swing a broken chair leg at Bruno, but the bear batted it aside like a twig, his roar shaking the walls. The intruders scrambled, panicked, slipping on snow and blood and fear. One managed to leap through the front window, shattering glass as he disappeared into the storm. The other tried to follow, but Tala blocked his path, her teeth bared, a deep growl rumbling in her chest. He dropped to his knees, babbling nonsense, until Kota shoved him out with a final snarl. Then, silence. The bears stood in the center of the wreckage, breathing heavy, their eyes searching. Clara, still against the wall, lifted her head. "Run," she whispered. He turned toward her, huffed softly, then stepped closer. Clara didn't flinch. Slowly, carefully, she reached out a hand. He nudged it with his snout, and for a brief, perfect moment, the warmth of his breath against her skin made the pain vanish. Kota came next, pressing his head gently to her shoulder. Tala lingered by the door, her eyes never leaving the storm beyond. Clara rested her hand on Kota's thick fur, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You came back." They stayed with her until the wind began to die down. When the sheriff arrived the next morning, called by a neighbor who'd seen smoke and heard strange sounds, he found Clara wrapped in blankets by the fire. Bruised but alert, sipping tea. The cabin was in disarray, blood on the floor, shattered glass everywhere. But there were tracks in the snow. Massive ones, leading away from the porch, back into the woods. "Bears did this?" the sheriff asked, disbelieving. Clara simply nodded. "They saved me." The story spread quickly. Some didn't believe it. Others called it a miracle. But those who knew Clara, who remembered the woman who once raised hawks and healed foxes and nursed a bear cub back to life, they understood. The forest had remembered her. And in its own way, it had come to collect the debt. The bears were never seen again, not up close, but sometimes, in the deep of night, Clara would wake and swear she heard something moving just beyond the tree line. Not men. Not danger. Just the quiet, unseen guardians who had once called her mother and who, even in the heart of a blizzard, had come when she needed them most. But Tala blocked his path, her teeth bared and her massive body still as a held breath, eyes locked on the man with a focus so fierce it rooted him in place. The room had turned to a battlefield of growls and screams and cracking wood, and for a moment the only sound was the fire crackling hungrily, as if it too bore witness to this impossible reckoning. Clara, still leaning against the wall, her head pounding and vision doubled, could scarcely believe what she saw. The cubs she had nursed with trembling hands, the ones who once cried for warmth and whimpered through nightmares, now stood like sentinels of vengeance, fierce and unyielding. Bruno advanced slowly on the man, who dropped the broken chair leg with shaking hands, his voice breaking as he begged, "Don't, please, I didn't mean to." But it didn't matter. Nature doesn't barter with cruelty, and these bears were not pets. They were wild, yes, but also something more. They were protectors, forged in the quiet sanctuary of her care, and something in them remembered that bond. Tala took one deliberate step forward and let out a guttural snarl, forcing the man to stumble back and crash into the hearth's stone edge. He yelped in pain and scrambled to his feet, darting toward the open front door, snow blasting through in violent gusts. Bruno didn't pursue. None of them did. The bears stood in a silent triangle around Clara, not moving, not growling anymore. The danger had passed. The storm still howled outside, but inside, a strange peace began to settle. Clara dropped slowly to the floor, her legs no longer willing to hold her. She placed a hand on her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts, her heart a wild thing caged beneath her ribs. The bears turned to her, one by one, Bruno first, then Kota, and lastly Tala. Each stared for a moment, as if waiting for her to speak, as if asking, "Are you safe?" She nodded, barely managing a whisper. "I'm all right, my darlings. You came back." Tala stepped closer, her massive paw silent on the wood floor. She lowered her head to Clara's, nudging her gently, her breath warm and thick with the scent of pine and snow. Clara raised her hand with effort, brushing her fingers along the side of Tala's face, feeling the dense fur, the power beneath it. For a brief second, time fell away. There was only breath and memory, warmth and wildness. Kota approached next, and finally Bruno, who lowered his massive body to the floor beside Clara, letting out a heavy sigh, as if the fight had taken all his strength. The wind outside began to die down, the storm losing its fury. Clara remained on the floor, her body aching, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. The fire's light flickered over the bear's fur, casting long shadows across the walls, painting the cabin with a surreal, sacred glow. She closed her eyes for a moment, only to open them again and find that the bears had risen. One by one, they moved toward the broken door, snow swirling around their retreating forms. Bruno paused at the threshold, turning back to look at her. She didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. In his dark, intelligent eyes, she saw what she had always hoped for but never dared believe: recognition, a goodbye, and something that lived between those two things. He stepped into the snow and vanished into the trees, followed by Kota and Tala, the wind swallowing their shapes like a dream returning to the earth. Clara didn't move for a long time. Her body throbbed with bruises, and blood had dried stiff in her hair, but her mind was clear, her soul ringing like a bell that had just been struck. When she finally stood, using the kitchen table for support, she limped to the front door and closed it with effort, sliding the broken lock into place and leaning her forehead against the wood. The cabin was wrecked, shelves torn down, glass shattered, furniture overturned, but she didn't care. The invaders were gone, and she had been spared because of them. The cubs she had raised in silence and solitude had returned in her greatest hour of need, wild hearts drawn home not by leash or law, but by love. She spent the night in her armchair by the fire, wrapped in blankets, a hot kettle near her feet. Sleep came in waves, broken by the crackle of embers and the soft creak of settling wood. In her dreams, the bears walked beside her through the forest, not as beasts, but as guardians. In the morning, Jake arrived. The storm had blocked the road all night, but a call from the sheriff, a report of two bloodied men found staggering down the mountain highway, had brought him rushing up the trail. When he entered the cabin and saw the wreckage, the blood on the floor, and Clara's bruised face, he froze. "Dear God, Clara," he said, rushing to her. "What happened?" She told him everything, quietly, carefully, without embellishment. Jake listened, his face unreadable, though his eyes flickered with disbelief more than once. "You're telling me the bears, your bears, they came back, and they saved you?" Clara nodded. "You don't have to believe it. But the tracks are there, and the wounds on those men match claw marks, not knives." Jake stood slowly, glancing around the ruined kitchen, his expression caught between awe and fear. "It shouldn't be possible," he said under his breath. "But they were always different, weren't they? They weren't just bears. They were yours." Clara didn't respond. She simply looked out the window at the forest beyond, snow still clinging to the branches, the air sharp and bright. Word of what had happened spread fast in Pinterest. The sheriff confirmed the break-in, the injuries, and, after some hesitation, the bear tracks leading to and from Clara's cabin. The townsfolk whispered about it for days. Some called it a miracle. Others, a fabrication. But most believed it. Because in Pinterest, the line between the wild and the human was always thin. No one doubted that something sacred lived in those woods. As the winter deepened and the cabin was slowly repaired, Clara settled back into her quiet life. But something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't just the old teacher at the edge of town anymore. She was something else now, a keeper of stories. A woman the forest hadn't forgotten. Sometimes at dusk, she would step onto her porch and scan the treeline, not hoping for another visit, but simply to feel the tether that still stretched between her and those 3 lives she had once held in her arms. And on rare nights, when the moon was full and the wind blew just right, she would hear them, a low, distant call echoing through the trees, wild and proud and free. And she would smile, place a hand over her heart, and whisper, "I remember you too." Spring returned to Pinterest with a slowness that felt ceremonial, like nature itself understood that something sacred had unfolded during the long winter and needed time to settle. To breathe. Snowmelt carved rivulets into the slopes behind Clara's cabin, pooling into shallow, shimmering ponds that reflected a sky finally blue again. The trees, still bare-limbed and skeletal, began to bud at their tips, the promise of green waiting just beneath the bark. Clara walked her land each morning with careful steps, her cane tapping gently against the stone path as she surveyed the damage from the storm and the night that had changed everything. The broken door had long since been replaced, the shattered windows mended, and yet every room still bore the memory of those few minutes that had stretched into a lifetime, the fear, the fight, and the impossible return of the wild hearts she had once called her own. She moved more slowly now, not from injury but from reverence. Each morning felt like a prayer. She no longer reached for things thoughtlessly or stepped into the woods without pausing first. The forest was no longer just her backdrop. It was alive in her story, pulsing with meaning. Watching. Jake visited often in the weeks that followed, helping her restock supplies and bring up firewood, though the need for heat was diminishing with each warmer day. He rarely brought up the night of the storm directly, but sometimes, as they shared tea on the porch, he'd glance at the treeline with something almost like wonder. Once he'd said, "I've spent my whole life studying wildlife, Clara. But what happened here, it doesn't fit in a manual. It fits in legend." Clara had only smiled, her fingers wrapped around her mug. The silence between them was deeper than words. Letters arrived, too, from former students who'd heard the story, from journalists sniffing for a headline, even from scientists who wanted to study the psychological imprint of human interaction on large predators. Clara didn't respond to most of them. She wasn't interested in theories or spectacles. What happened that night belonged to her and to those 3 bears alone. Explaining it would only cheapen it, like tearing a painting from a wall to examine the brushstrokes. It was meant to be experienced, not dissected. And besides, she wasn't looking to be remembered for this. She had already lived a full life, of purpose, of lessons taught and lives touched. The final chapter of her story didn't need applause. It had been enough that they came back. That they remembered. That they saved her. And yet, even with that peace, a quiet restlessness had begun to stir inside her. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of solitude, not of death, not even of being forgotten. But she felt something unfinished, something waiting, as if the story that had begun all those months ago when Jake had knocked on her door with 3 frightened bundles in tow hadn't quite closed its final line. So one day in early May, she rose before dawn, packed a small canvas satchel with water, a wool blanket, a tin of dried fruit, and the old field journal she hadn't opened in 20 years. She wrapped a scarf around her throat, shrugged into her coat, and stepped into the pale morning light. The air was crisp but gentle, the kind that whispered against the skin rather than bit. She didn't tell Jake she was going, she didn't need company, and she wasn't entirely sure where she was headed. Only that she had to go. The trail behind the cabin had long since faded, overtaken by moss and the quiet creep of time. But her feet remembered it. Her body remembered it too, as if the bones in her legs had always known the forest's rhythm. She moved slowly, stopping often to rest, leaning on her cane when the incline steepened. But she didn't turn back. Birds called overhead, their songs hesitant and exploratory, and somewhere in the distance, a brook murmured beneath thawed snow. She passed familiar landmarks long lost to memory, the half-buried fence post from her first property line, the blackened stump from where lightning once split a pine in two, the mossy stone where she'd once sat with a fox kit in her lap. The walk took hours, and by the time she reached the ridge, her breath was short and her knees ached. But she pressed forward until the trees thinned and the land opened into a small clearing at the top. This was where she had first let Samson go, all those years ago. She had carried him in a crate on her back, no bigger than a sack of flour, and watched him tumble clumsily into the wild with no understanding of how far he'd come. And now, she stood in that same clearing, half a lifetime later, looking out over a valley softened by new green, the river below catching the sun like a thread of silver. She sat carefully on a fallen log and took out her field journal, opening it to a blank page. Her hands shook as she held the pen, but the words came easily. She didn't write about science. She didn't write about behavior or data or analysis. She wrote about the sound of Kota's breath as he leaned into her shoulder, about the warmth in Tala's eyes, about the power in Bruno's silent defense. She wrote about trust and memory and the kind of love that exists beyond domestication, beyond ownership, a love that survives even when untamed. She wrote until the sun reached its peak, and then she closed the journal and laid it gently beside her on the log, pressing her palm to the cover. "If anyone finds this," she said aloud, her voice thin in the open air, "know that I was never alone." And then she waited. She didn't expect anything, but she hoped. The wind stirred through the trees behind her, lifting her hair and carrying with it the scent of pine and earth and something older. And just as she began to rise to her feet, there it was, a sound. Not loud. Not urgent. A slow, deliberate crack of a branch. She turned. From the shadows between the trees, a shape emerged. Then another. And another. Bruno, taller now, broader, his fur sleek with health and power. Kota, eyes bright, sniffing the air with a cautious grace. Tala, stepping with the stillness of moonlight, her head lowered slightly in greeting. Clara's breath caught. Her legs gave way, and she sat back down hard on the log, her heart racing. The bears didn't rush her. They didn't growl or posture. They simply stood there, massive and silent and undeniably real. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, Tala stepped forward. Clara held still, tears rising unbidden. Tala stopped a few feet away, lowered her head, and let out a soft chuff. Clara extended her hand, not expecting contact, only offering presence. Tala sniffed it once, then turned and moved away. Bruno followed, then Kota, until they were a trio again, walking slowly through the clearing toward the trees. Clara watched them go, her chest aching in the most beautiful way. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. She sat for a long time after they were gone, her face wet with tears and wind, her journal heavy beside her. The forest was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. When she finally stood, her body protested, but her spirit soared. The walk back was slower, gentler, her cane steady in the softening earth. By the time she reached the cabin, the sky had begun to shift toward evening. Birds chirped from the eaves, and the first star blinked to life overhead. She built a small fire and sat by the hearth, the journal in her lap. She didn't write again that night. She didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said. The bears had returned once more, not to save her, not to fight, but simply to be seen. To remind her that the bond remained. That wild things do remember kindness. And that sometimes, if you give your heart freely enough, it will find its way back to you again and again in forms you never imagined. Clara Winslow passed quietly in her sleep 2 winters later, wrapped in wool blankets, a fire still crackling in the hearth. When Jake found her, the cabin was warm and peaceful, the journal resting on her table beside a cup of untouched tea. Outside, fresh snow had fallen, and just beyond the edge of the porch, 3 sets of paw prints circled in the powder, heading back into the trees. No one ever saw the bears again. But every spring, crocuses bloomed early at the edge of Clara's clearing. And the people of Pinterest told her story, not with doubt or debate, but with reverence. Because in the end, Clara wasn't just a woman who once raised bear cubs. She was the heart of the mountain. The quiet thread between the human and the wild. And proof that love, pure, fearless, and given without condition, can echo long after we're gone.